Most Christian men believe dating is basically random, that if they stay faithful, stay patient, and stay involved in the church, then eventually they will get chosen. But that's not exactly how selection works, because inside the Christian dating culture, just like everywhere else, there is a hierarchy. Some men consistently get chosen. Some men consistently don't. And it's not always about who is the most spiritual. And if you don't understand how that hierarchy works and how to make it work for you, then you can spend years doing just about everything right. And as far as dating goes, you could still stay invisible. This video is not about blaming women, but it is about a pattern that most men quietly notice even if they're unable to explain it. And if we're going to be honest about this, the stakes are incredibly high when it comes to marriage for a Christian man. Because when you do get married, it's almost like you get access to the good life. Not my words. That's the language that Effective Purpose used for it, and I think it basically applies. Simply put, churches look at married men very differently than they do single men. And you do get more status when you are married. So finding a woman to marry in church isn't just about romance or even your marital status. There's a whole lot more at stake. In many ways, it will influence your place in that church and whether or not you even desire to remain there in the first place. Because recent studies show that men, specifically married men with children, are actually the highest demographic group that consistently attends church. So when things go left on this issue, the church also gets left behind by a whole bunch of single men. And if you just observe what actually goes on in any church, again, focusing on those who are single and desire to be married, you will notice that some men consistently put themselves out there and date. Like they find their way into relationships, which is normally a precursor to actually getting to a marriage. But some men consistently don't. They're almost never in a relationship. And it's not always about who is the most spiritual that determines which group you're in. Because virtue and visibility are not the same currency. Allow me to explain. Because general rhetoric in the church, and I'm not here to argue about it, we're just going to deal with it, that men are supposed to pursue women. But in the context of a dating culture, both people are making a choice. That's kind of where this whole romantic foundation for it comes from. A woman does actually have to choose a man, just as much as that man has to choose that woman. So it doesn't matter who you want to pursue if you are a man. Like, let's just buy into it for a moment. You can be interested in a woman, but if she's not interested back, this relationship is going nowhere. And some men feel like they have a whole bunch of options, and they might even be right about that. But other men feel like they have almost no options, certainly not any that they're able to identify. So what causes that? Because in Christian dating, the hierarchy is created based off of two different metrics. They're always competing against each other, and they create a relationship. Because there is a spiritual metric, but there's also a secular one, if we're being real about that. And the men who have enough of both are the ones who will consistently be able to get into relationships. Even if you have enough of one, specifically the secular one, you might still be able to get into relationships. But if all you have is the spiritual one, it's likely not going to work. And I'm going to come back to this part in a moment. Because what actually creates selection, if you are a woman, is that they're likely going to do it based on the following: a sense of the man's direction, his momentum, and even to a degree social proof. In other words, if other people think this man is of value, that raises his value. And if other people don't, like they don't have great things to say about him, specifically as if he's desirable, well, you do fall down the list. But they also care about emotional steadiness, the man's leadership energy, and for that matter, his status inside the group. In other words, these are the things that aren't the real decision-making factors: Bible knowledge, agreeableness, or even volunteer hours. Simply put, the men who get chosen are oftentimes not waiting. They are moving. And I did say I was going to come back to the spiritual metric, like the scale how women might evaluate, as well as the secular one. And if we're going to be real, the best way I can explain it is you have to think of it in terms of ideals. So what is the ideal man in a godly sense that a woman might be interested in? And then what is an ideal man in a secular cultural sense, once again, men have to travel up both of these lists well enough with a combination that a woman is willing to accept in order for her to be interested in choosing him as a husband. Because again, I get it, language of pursuit from men to women, but in a dating culture, both people are making a choice. And in the secular context, people generally know what success looks like. It looks like financial stability, physical attractiveness, confidence, and charisma. And as far as how a woman envisions that at its highest level, I mean, it can go different ways. But generally, people know what it is and what it is not. But on a godly scale, there is a reason why, when we think about the most desirable men, they generally start to become the men who take on the closest approximation of pastoral energy. And that makes sense if you see how we do church. Because most pastors are men, and when you see pastors who are preaching on a Sunday, they're quite literally on a platform where many people are listening to one person. If that's not leadership, I don't know what is. But if you're new here, I want to say thank you for even making it this far into the video. My name is Ezra, and if relationships that actually work are really what you want, I believe anybody can have it if you ask the right questions. Because if the word of God is actually true, then I've got a whole lot of repenting to do. And if anything that I say actually connects with you, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe. But if I don't, just let me know in the comments section, because I try to read them all. But the current structure of church creates only a small window for men to ascend to those roles. In other words, most people don't share that same pastoral energy. They're not in a position to be viewed that way. And churches do not raise up a whole bunch of men as pastors and as leaders, at least not in the current model. Yes, to some degree, you may have churches with small groups and other things where pockets of leadership can occur. And that might make a man more attractive to any specific woman. But in general, it's really hard to get into that select group of men who are desirable. Because to do it, you have to get into that select group that is on the pastoral pathway, even if you're not necessarily a pastor. See where I'm going with this? Remember, there's a relationship between these two lists. The godly characteristics, or what that might look like, as well as the secular. As long as you have enough of both, you might get chosen. But to clarify, if all you have is the godly characteristics, but none of the secular characteristics, it's likely not going to work out as well for a legitimate reason. Because there are also hidden filters where a woman might assess a man based on things like, is he respected by other men? Does he take initiative socially? Does he create environments? Or for that matter, is he decisive? And of course, they want to know if he has forward trajectory. And for that matter, where that trajectory might land. These are not immoral filters. They're actually just human ones. But once again, if we're going to call this out and be real about it, these things definitely change a lot depending on age and stage. Because if you are a young man who has experienced some form of discipleship heading into your young adulthood, and you're active and put yourself out there looking to date and find a wife, the rules are very different than if you're doing this after the age of 30. And I'm going to break this down. So if you're a young Christian man and you find a woman who is willing to be pursued, notice, that's the language I chose for, and you actually walk that out and pursue her. Generally speaking, you have a pretty good opportunity to get all the way toward marriage. And the reason is because if you assess the list of what women might be doing, specifically amongst the hidden filters, like when we talk about things like trajectory, most of what they're assessing is still in the potential column when you are young, like 22, 23, 24, 25. Potential isn't fully realized. So people are placing a bet on where you're going to go, not where you've already arrived. And it's much easier to draft on potential than it is to draft on results. But as people get older, that rapidly changes, and they judge people a whole lot more harshly. Generally speaking, I would say this peaks around the 30s, where at that point, potential isn't the word people want to hear anymore. They want to see that potential realized. Who are you? And do you measure up to whatever their standard is of what they think they deserve? So you could argue that perhaps dating in your 30s, especially once you get to the mid part, it's almost like the peak level of pickiness. Because for those who are still single and desire to be married, if they feel like they've been waiting for the right person, by this point, they've concluded that they don't want to settle. But if people remain single into their 40s, this actually reshuffles the deck a little bit. Because by that point, most people generally are going to get real about, like, if I'm going to get married, I'm going to have to marry, for lack of a better term, who's on the board. Like, who's actually available and what circumstances do they come with. You're going to see a lot more compromise at that point. But the irony is that although women might be more likely to give a chance to a man whom they would not have accepted, perhaps in their 30s or even in their 20s, men, normally by that point, can also feel checked out on relationships. Because studies do show that men generally have like a season or a phase of like when they're, I guess what you would call at marrying age, or like when they're actively looking. And if they don't happen to get married while they're in that window, and then they cross over beyond it, it lowers their interest in marriage significantly. Simply put, men can wait to get married. So much so that eventually they just check out on it entirely. And many men miss out on identifying these hidden filters for a few reasons. But it all stems back to the messaging that people receive about what Christian dating should be. Men are often told to be good, to be patient, and for that matter, to be available. Waiting on the right woman gets glorified in such a way where activity levels, like actually putting an effort, starts to kind of fall by the wayside. And even when men do, I've also covered this in other videos, that oftentimes it ends up putting them in the friend zone because a man can gain the approval of a woman without making her attracted to him. And that's because church culture rarely teaches how to build leverage or to develop social gravity or even how to increase competence visibly. And remember, if you happen to be a pastor or somebody who's demonstratively in front of the church and you are a single man, you're displaying competence visibly. So women are going to notice you. Simply put, the system didn't necessarily lie to men. It just left something out, something incredibly crucial, because this has major impact on the church at large. And I am talking at the averages and the extremes, because most church environments have only a few men who are a part of them, who become socially central. And those men are the ones who are visible. The rest of the men are likely going to become peripheral. And if you're a man who feels like you're on the periphery, you are likely going to disengage. Remember, even if you are building yourself up spiritually, if you are not socially visible, like someone who is on a pastoral track, and you are speaking or communicating in public forum, and maybe that's just not your gifting or what you're, predisposed to. And if you're not seen, women are likely not going to choose you. The men who will normally surpass this, like this part won't apply to them, are the men who have enough secular proof, like enough of the secular list that women are interested in, where even if they're not very vocal and they're not, socially central to the life of the church, if he's tall enough, if he's wealthy enough, for lack of a better term, if he's attractive enough, if he's confident enough, if he's charismatic enough, all of these things might make women interested, even if they're really not worried as much anymore about the spiritual components. Of course, some of those men might be enough of the secular stuff and be growing in Christ. I mean, hey, that's the glitch in there. But that's not most men, if we're just being real about it. Many men end up on the periphery, where they don't have enough of everything else, and they're not visible enough otherwise. And those men are likely going to disengage. What this also means is that the dating imbalance that we are witnessing in the church is not random. It is structural, because in most churches, there are only a few spots available for men to become socially visible, specifically if they are single. Women do not carry anywhere near as much pressure, but they still have to choose a man. And if they feel like they are settling, they're going to choose no one and continue to wait. The real question isn't whether Christian men are good enough. The question is whether they understand how selection actually works. But I really do want to know if you believe that Christian dating actually has a hierarchy, or if a better way to describe it is that things are basically random out there. If you actually made it all the way to the end of this video, I do have to admit that thank you doesn't do it justice anymore, because you are a real one. As far as if anything I said actually connects with you, I do invite you to comment. Just be honest, share your experiences. I do the best that I can to actually read them all. And if nothing else, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe.